There is a place in the Nevada desert where the silence is so complete, so deep and unbroken, that you can hear your own heartbeat. It sits at the edge of a dry lake bed called Groom Lake, roughly 83 miles northwest of Las Vegas, though it feels like it belongs to a different world entirely. A world where the air shimmers with heat in summer and freezes sharp and brittle in winter. Where the mountains on the horizon are the color of old charcoal, and the sky above is so wide and so blue that it seems almost theatrical, like someone painted it that way to make everything else feel small by comparison. You cannot drive there, not directly anyway. The roads that approach it are watched, gated, and marked with signs that are unusually direct in their warnings. Signs that say things like, use of deadly force is authorized. Signs that suggest, rather firmly, that the curiosity you brought with you would be better turned around and driven back the way it came. If you stand at the edge of the public road nearest to the base, a stretch of Nevada State Route 375, which the state officially renamed the Extraterrestrial Highway back in 1996, partly as a joke and partly because it was already drawing more visitors than any road with so little on it reasonably should. You can sometimes see the white trucks parked on the ridgeline, just sitting there, watching, waiting for nothing and everything at once. The land itself is ancient beyond easy reckoning. The basin that holds Groom Lake was carved and shaped by geological forces operating over millions of years, by the slow grinding of tectonic plates and the patient work of wind and water. The dry lake bed at its center, a flat expanse of pale sediment, sometimes called a playa, is so level and so firm that it makes a near-perfect natural runway. It was this quality, more than anything else, that first drew certain government officials to look at it on a map in the early 1950s and quietly circle it in pencil. The nearest town is Rachel, Nevada, and when people say it is a small town, they mean something more extreme than the phrase usually suggests. Rachel has, at last count, somewhere between 50 and 100 permanent residents, depending on the season and how loosely you define the word permanent. It has a bar and restaurant called the Little A-Lin, a pun that the sign out front commits to with real conviction, and it has a small collection of trailers and mobile homes arranged along a stretch of road with the patient, unsurprised quality of people who have long since made their peace with living at the edge of something they cannot see or fully explain. The base itself, viewed in the satellite images that became freely available once commercial mapping services decided the whole concept of strategic secrecy had perhaps met its match in a consumer GPS application, is enormous. It has expanded significantly from its original footprint. There are runways, long ones, very long ones, the kind that suggest something landing or taking off at unusual speeds. There are hangars large enough that the scale of them only becomes apparent when you notice what appear to be parked aircraft beside them and realize, with some recalibration of your mental scale, that those aircraft are themselves quite large. There are buildings, roads, water storage, and all the unremarkable machinery of a place where serious work is done seriously, every day. All of it ringed by motion sensors and cameras, and those quiet white trucks on the ridgelines. What is happening inside, at this very moment, is unknown to the public. Not mostly unknown, not approximately unknown, genuinely, formally, legally unknown, protected by classification levels that exist in a category their own government handlers are not always clear to fully understand. And that particular flavor of official, enforced, armed unknowing is precisely what makes this place one of the most fascinating locations on the surface of the planet. Its official name, to the limited extent that it has one, is the Nevada Test and Training Range, or more specifically, the Nellis Air Force Base Test and Training Range. The Air Force sometimes refers to it by its aviation designation, Homey Airport, with the call sign KXTA, a name so deliberately mundane it almost achieves comedy. The people who worked there in its earliest days called it by a different name. They called it Paradise Ranch, a cheerful piece of sarcasm invented to make the assignment sound appealing to engineers and pilots who were about to spend months in the middle of nowhere, eating in a cafeteria and sleeping in prefabricated buildings, and watching the most extraordinary aircraft in the world take flight before breakfast. Most of the rest of the world knows it by a name derived from a Cold War-era map grid designation, a number so unremarkable that it somehow became one of the most loaded and significant numbers in the American cultural vocabulary. They call it Area 51. And tonight, slowly, gently, with all the time in the world and no rush at all, we are going to walk through its strange and extraordinary history together, from the prehistoric silence of the desert to the gleaming spy planes of the Cold War, to the conspiracy theories that made it famous, and the real secrets that were, in their own way, stranger and more remarkable than the stories that replaced them. Settle in. Close your eyes if you like. Let your breathing slow to the rhythm of a quiet Nevada night. The desert is calm tonight. The stars above Groom Lake are impossibly bright. And somewhere out there, behind the fences and the warning signs and the watching eyes on the ridgeline, something has always been happening. Let us begin at the very beginning. Before we go any further, if this kind of slow, calm walk through history is what your late nights have been needing, I would genuinely love it if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We are on a journey to reach 1,000 subscribers here on Heyo, and every single one of them counts more than I can say. Leave a comment telling me where in your world you're listening from and what time it is on your clock tonight. I read every one of them, and there is something oddly wonderful about knowing who else is drifting off to the same quiet corner of history at the same strange hour. If you have any sleepy hype left in you, send it our way. It means everything. Now, back to the desert. Section 2. Before the Base, Nevada's Hidden World. Long before there was a fence, there was only the land. The Great Basin, the vast interior plateau that occupies most of Nevada and stretches into parts of Utah, Oregon, and Idaho, is one of the most geologically dynamic places in North America. It is a region shaped by the stretching and pulling of the Earth's crust, a slow motion tearing apart that has been happening for roughly 30 million years and shows no particular sign of stopping. The result is a landscape of alternating mountain ranges and flat valleys, each valley separated from the next by a ridge of peaks, each valley holding at its lowest point the remnants of ancient lakes that filled and drained and filled again over the long cycles of ice ages and warmer periods. Groom Lake is one of these remnant basins. In wetter geological periods, it held real water. Species of pupfish, tiny, silvery, improbably resilient fish, evolved in the isolated water bodies of this region, adapting to salinity and temperature extremes that would kill most freshwater creatures within hours. Their descendants still exist in some of the region's remaining springs and shallow ponds, living relics of a wetter world. The lake itself, however, has been dry for a very long time. What remains is the lake bed, a surface of light-coloured silt and salt deposits, so flat and so firm that it can support the weight of heavily loaded aircraft touching down at extraordinary speeds. This quality of the landscape did not go unnoticed. During the Second World War, the United States military needed vast, empty spaces in which to practice things it could not practice near populated areas. Gunnery ranges, bombing corridors, training runs for pilots who needed to fire weapons at something that was not a building or a farm. The Nevada desert, with its reliable, clear visibility, its scarce population, and its seemingly endless empty miles, was ideal for this purpose in ways that few other places in the continental United States could match. The area that would eventually become Area 51 was used during the war years as an aerial gunnery range, a place where pilots could train their aim against ground targets without the inconvenience of accidentally hitting anything that mattered to anyone. When the war ended in 1945, the formal military presence in the area diminished but did not disappear. The world had changed in ways that were not yet fully legible, but were already deeply felt. The atomic bomb had changed the character of conflict in a single blinding moment, and the world had entered the age of nuclear weapons in a transition so abrupt that the institutions and doctrines and strategic calculations of the old era were obsolete almost overnight. The Nevada test site was established in January 1951 as a domestic nuclear testing ground. The United States had been conducting its nuclear tests in the Pacific at Bikini Atoll and Enuatak, but logistics were complex and the distances enormous. The Nevada site offered proximity to the laboratories and the engineers who needed to observe the tests and measure their results. It also offered, as a side effect that would generate its own complicated consequences, proximity to the civilian population of southern Nevada, which sometimes watched mushroom clouds rise above the desert from the rooftops of Las Vegas hotels in the early morning hours. What matters for our story tonight is that the Nevada test site established a precedent and a framework. This was a place where the federal government could do things quietly, where the airspace could be restricted and the restriction enforced, where the security apparatus was already in place and the culture of secrecy already normalized, where strangers asking questions were met with institutional answers that conveyed just enough to deflect curiosity without conveying anything of actual substance. By the early 1950s, the Cold War was not an abstraction. It was a daily, grinding pressure on everything, on military planning, on diplomatic language, on the way serious people in Washington thought about the future. The Soviet Union had successfully tested its own nuclear device in August 1949, years ahead of Western estimates of their capability. This single fact was alarming in ways that went beyond the technical reality of the test. If the estimates had been so wrong about Soviet nuclear development, what else might they be wrong about? The Korean War, beginning in 1950 and ending in a difficult stalemate in 1953, had confirmed that the Cold War could generate hot conflicts with real casualties and uncertain outcomes, And at the center of all the strategic anxiety was a single question that American military and intelligence planners could not answer with confidence. What was the Soviet Union actually doing? How many nuclear weapons did they have? Where were the bombers? What were the factories producing? The Soviet Union was, in those years, genuinely opaque to Western intelligence. Human agents were difficult to place and prone to bad endings. Electronic surveillance had its limits, and the borders of the Soviet Empire were not places where casual observation was possible. What was needed, some people began to argue, was the ability to look from above, from very far above, to fly over Soviet territory and photograph what was there, in detail, without being shot down, without provoking the kind of international crisis that nobody wanted on their desk.
This was, on its face, an audacious idea. The Soviets had radar, they had fighters, they had surface-to-air missiles in development. But the need was acute enough and the technological possibilities intriguing enough that conversations began about what an aircraft specifically designed for high-altitude reconnaissance might look like and where it might be built and tested in sufficient secrecy. Those conversations eventually led to a meeting, and that meeting led to a man named Kelly Johnson. And Kelly Johnson led 3 men on a small aircraft over the Nevada desert on a spring morning in 1955, looking down at a dry lake bed and quietly imagining what it might become. In April of 1955, a small Beechcraft aircraft took off from somewhere in California and flew northeast toward the Nevada desert. On board were 3 men, whose names would become significant in the history of American aviation, though at the time they were simply 3 men with an engineering problem to solve and a very large, very empty desert to assess. The 3 men were Richard Bissell, the CIA's project manager for a new and highly classified aerial reconnaissance program, Colonel Osmond Ritland from the Air Force, serving as Bissell's military liaison, and Clarence Leonard Johnson, who went by Kelly, who was the chief designer and founding spirit of what would become one of the most consequential aircraft design organizations in the history of aerospace. Kelly Johnson ran the Advanced Development Projects Division of the Lockheed Corporation, based in Burbank, California. The division had earned the informal nickname Skunk Works, reportedly from a reference to the moonshine distillery in the Al Cap comic strip Lil Abner, a name used internally long before it became famous externally. The Skunk Works operated with unusual independence, a small and tightly controlled team of engineers who worked on projects so sensitive that most of Lockheed's own employees did not know they existed. Johnson ran the organization with exacting standards, minimal bureaucracy, and a particular talent for attracting brilliant people and persuading them to do things they had not previously believed were possible. He had a conviction that a small group of excellent engineers, given direct access to the people who flew the aircraft and the people who used its output, could achieve things that a larger group moving through conventional institutional channels could not. Everything the Skunk Works produced in the decades to come was evidence in favor of this conviction. The request the CIA had brought to Johnson in 1954 was the most demanding thing any design organization had ever been asked. Build an aircraft, the brief essentially said, that can sustain flight at altitudes above 70,000 feet, high enough to be above the effective ceiling of Soviet radar, high enough to be above anything Soviet fighters could reach in sustained pursuit, high enough to be, for all practical purposes, beyond reach, and build it in a way that allows it to carry cameras capable of photographing ground targets with enough resolution to be intelligence useful. and keep the entire project, the aircraft's existence, its purpose, and its location, absolutely secret.
Johnson said he believed he could do it. The design was already forming in his notebooks, a strange, elongated aircraft with enormous wings relative to its body, almost like a powered glider, that would sacrifice speed and conventional military performance for the ability to sustain extraordinary altitude. It would be powered by a single engine, carefully optimized for the thin and cold upper atmosphere. It would be built as lightly as possible. It would be called the U-2, a designation that officially stood for utility, suggesting something as unremarkable as a postal aircraft, which was entirely deliberate. The Beechcraft carrying Johnson, Bissell, and Ritland circled the Groom Lake Basin that April morning, while the three men looked down at what the Nevada desert offered them. A dry lake bed nearly 3 miles long and 1.5 miles wide, almost perfectly flat, firm enough in most conditions to support aircraft without extensive preparation. Mountains on all sides forming a natural bowl that provided visual screening. Absolute remoteness from civilian populations. Adjacency to the already restricted Nevada test site, meaning existing security infrastructure and an established culture of official reticence. Ritland reportedly said to Johnson as they circled, "That will work." Johnson agreed. President Dwight Eisenhower personally signed off on the acquisition of the site. This was not a detail delegated to subordinates. Eisenhower understood both the program's importance and its risks, and he approved the site and the program with the directness of a man who had spent his career at the intersection of intelligence and strategy, and knew how to make large decisions clearly. Construction began in the summer of 1955, with a speed the surrounding emptiness made possible. A runway was graded and surfaced on the dry lake bed. Hangars went up, fuel storage was installed, water supply was arranged. The basic infrastructure to house and feed and work a small population of engineers, pilots, and support staff was assembled in weeks. The facilities were basic, prefabricated buildings, simple dormitory quarters, a cafeteria that prioritized function over pleasure. The workers who arrived that summer were told they were going to Paradise Ranch. The name was coined by someone with a dry sense of humor and a realistic assessment of the Nevada summer heat, the persistent dust, the absence of anything ranchy in the conventional sense, and the considerable distance from anything resembling paradise. But it served a purpose. A name suggests a known and settled thing. Paradise Ranch was just a place people worked, nothing particularly worth asking about. The program was codenamed Aquatone. The aircraft was sometimes called Angel internally, which suited it better than Paradise Ranch suited the base. In the late summer of 1955, as the first aircraft arrived partially assembled, and the engineers began the careful work of putting it together in a sealed hangar, the base began to become what it would remain for the next 7 decades and counting. A secret with a purpose. Section 4. The U-2. A plane that changed everything. Picture the sky above Nevada on a clear summer morning in 1956. The kind of sky that exists in high desert places, far from city light and thick, humid air. A blue so deep and consistent it seems structural, almost solid, like a ceiling made of something more reliable than mere atmosphere. And moving through that sky, so high it appears from the ground as nothing more than a slow-moving silver thread, barely distinguishable from a scratch in the glass of the sky, an aircraft unlike anything that has flown before it. The U-2 cruised at altitudes between 65,000 and 70,000 feet. Commercial airliners of the mid-1950s flew at around 20,000 feet. Military jet fighters of the era could reach perhaps 45,000 feet in brief climbing efforts. The U-2 flew above all of them, in a layer of the atmosphere where the sky above begins to shade from blue toward the deep violet black of the upper edge of everything breathable, and where the curvature of the earth is perceptible as a gentle arc on the far horizon. Kelly Johnson's engineering solution for reaching this altitude was unconventional enough that some traditionally minded aeronautical engineers viewed it with polite skepticism. The U-2 had a wingspan of 80 feet on a fuselage only 49 feet long. The ratio of wing to body was more characteristic of a high-performance glider than any conventional powered aircraft. This was deliberate. Those enormous wings generated lift in the extremely thin, cold air of the upper atmosphere, where conventional wing proportions would have failed to provide enough force to sustain flight.
The aircraft was delicate in ways that mattered enormously to the pilots who flew it. It had almost no margin of airspeed between the velocity at which it would stall, fall from the sky because the wings could no longer generate enough lift, and the velocity at which compressibility problems would begin affecting its structure in the other direction. Pilots called this narrow acceptable band the coffin corner, a term that managed to be simultaneously technical and perfectly descriptive. In the thin air of the upper atmosphere, where control inputs responded slowly and corrections unfolded over long seconds, staying within the coffin corner required constant, unbroken attention. The pilot suits the pilots wore were early versions of what would become spacesuits. Flying at 70,000 feet without one would mean rapid incapacitation and death. The suits maintained pressure around the pilot's body, allowing normal breathing and circulation, but they were hot and constrictive and limited movement in ways that added substantially to the strain of missions lasting 8 or 9 hours. The pilots selected for the program were chosen for flying ability and psychological stability in equal measure. They were told, in terms that did not leave much room for comfortable ambiguity, that if they were shot down over Soviet territory during a mission, rescue was not something they could expect. The aircraft carried a self-destruct mechanism. They were given cover stories and equipment for the worst case, and the briefings described that equipment's purpose in language that was clinical without being gentle. These men accepted these terms and flew anyway, mission after mission, year after year, in an aircraft that demanded everything from them for a purpose they believed in enough to accept conditions that most people would have declined.
The first operational overflight of the Soviet Union took place on July 4, 1956. Independence Day, chosen with a certain deliberateness. The aircraft departed from a base in West Germany, crossed into Soviet airspace, photographed military installations and industrial facilities deep within the Soviet Empire, and returned safely to base. The photographs were extraordinary. The feared bomber gap, the fear that the Soviet Union had built far more long-range bombers than the United States, turned out to be substantially overstated. The photographs did not eliminate the threat of Soviet military power. They clarified it, which was what intelligence was designed to do. And clarity, even when what clarity revealed was still concerning, was better than fear operating without evidence. Meanwhile, the test flights over Nevada that trained pilots and refined the aircraft's systems were producing an unexpected and significant side effect. Commercial airline pilots flying at lower altitudes on routes across the American West were looking up and seeing something at an altitude where nothing was supposed to be. Something silver and bright,
reflecting sunlight at angles that made it glow against a sky that had already darkened at lower elevations. Something moving steadily and at speed, leaving no contrail, making no sound that reached the ground. They reported it. Air traffic control had no explanation. The military, when asked, had nothing true to say.
The CIA's own declassified history of the U-2 program would eventually state directly that U-2 flights over the continental United States caused what it called a tremendous increase in reports of unidentified flying objects during the late 1950s. More than half of all UFO reports filed with the Air Force in that period could be attributed to U-2 sightings. The Air Force was simultaneously running Project Blue Book, its official UFO investigation. Blue Book investigators received these reports. They could not explain them because the true explanation was classified far above their clearance level. So the sightings were filed as unidentified, which was, in a narrow technical sense, accurate. The government's preference was clear. Let the UFO theories multiply rather than compromise the classified program. A rumor about strange lights in the sky was manageable. The truth about a top-secret reconnaissance program flying over sovereign foreign territory was diplomatically dangerous in very specific and immediate ways. So the mystery was officially protected, and the mystery grew. The Soviets, for their part, knew the overflights were happening. Their radar tracked the aircraft on most missions. Their surface-to-air missiles could not reach it. Their fastest fighters could not sustain the altitude required to intercept it. They filed formal protests through diplomatic channels. The American government denied the flights were occurring. This denial was maintained through 4 years. 4 years of systematic overflights, dozens of missions, photographs of enormous intelligence value, all of it underpinned by a stated official position that none of it was happening. Until it was. Section 5. Life inside the fence.
The men and women who worked at Area 51 in its early decades did not, for the most part, arrive there by anything resembling ordinary employment. They were recruited, selected, approached by someone who had already conducted a background investigation and who offered them work that was described in interesting enough terms to accept, but never in specific enough terms to know exactly what was being accepted. The journey to the base was itself a carefully managed exercise in the mechanics of secrecy. Workers who did not fly in on the unmarked aircraft operating out of a restricted terminal at McCarran Airport in Las Vegas, a service that would eventually become known publicly as Janet Airlines from its radio call sign, though for years the service's existence was itself officially unacknowledged, arrived by bus. The buses had their windows blacked out or covered to prevent passengers from tracking their route. The roads into the restricted area were themselves part of the classified picture. Knowing the precise approach route meant knowing something about the security perimeter's geography, and knowing things without operational necessity was not encouraged. Arrival at the base was governed by layers of credentialing and compartmentalization. The facility operated at the sensitive compartmental information classification level, which meant in practice that it contained multiple programs classified separately from one another. Knowing about one program's existence did not grant awareness of any other. A technician who serviced aircraft in one hangar might be entirely unaware that in other hangars, other aircraft were being assembled under different program names with different clearances. The programs were nested inside the facility like sealed containers within sealed containers. Workers signed non-disclosure agreements before beginning and were reminded of them regularly. The cultural emphasis on secrecy was total and extended to social behavior in ways that shaped the daily texture of life. In common areas, the cafeteria, the recreation rooms, an unwritten and universally understood protocol governed conversation. You did not discuss your work beyond the broadest generalities. You did not ask others about theirs.
This mutual silence was not unfriendliness, it was professional courtesy of the most consequential kind. Families were told only what social necessity required. A spouse knew their partner worked for the government, somewhere in Nevada, on something that could not be described. Children grew up knowing their fathers came home on unpredictable schedules, left on buses to unknown places, and that questions about it were not something the family asked. Some families accepted this with equanimity, others found it difficult. The secrecy had weight, and the weight was distributed unevenly. The physical environment at the base, while not luxurious, was less Spartan than the earliest descriptions of Paradise Ranch might suggest, at least as the base developed through the late 1950s and 1960s. There was a cafeteria, recreational facilities, volleyball courts, areas for cards and socializing in the evenings. People formed friendships, the particular closeness of people who had all accepted the same unusual terms and were doing unusual things in an unusual place, and who could not discuss any of it with the outside world.
The pilots who flew the classified aircraft had the most visible relationship with the secrecy, and in some ways the most psychologically complex one. They were doing something genuinely extraordinary, flying aircraft that no other human beings had flown, at altitudes that essentially no other human beings had reached in powered flight, for a purpose they understood clearly was strategically important. And then they landed, and ate in the cafeteria, and played cards, and could not say much about where they had been. Years later, when declassification permitted them to speak, many described not resentment exactly, they had chosen this after all, but a certain accumulated weight, experience that could not be processed through the ordinary channels, conversation, storytelling, the natural human way of making meaning through sharing. They found other ways. They carried it. The base provided a community of people who understood, at the professional level, what others were going through, even when the specific details could not be made explicit. The support staff, mechanics, engineers, camera technicians, operated under their own varieties of intensity. Equipment failure at altitude had consequences spelled out in program documentation without euphemism. A pressure system failure, an engine malfunction, an error in aircraft preparation that sent a pilot into a situation the aircraft could not handle. These were not remote theoretical possibilities. They were specific risks that the people doing the maintenance understood personally and carried with them into every inspection. A maintenance error that grounded an aircraft was embarrassing. A maintenance error that killed a pilot was something else entirely.
Outside the fence, the world continued. Las Vegas grew. The atomic tests at the Nevada test site occasionally sent tremors through the Groom Lake Basin, felt by the workers but unremarked upon. The Cold War ground forward with the quality of something that seemed eternal, and in the cafeteria and the recreation rooms, people ate and played cards and talked about everything except the work. There was a pride in this, by most accounts, a pride in knowing the work mattered, that the sacrifice of ordinary transparency was in the service of something real, not glamorous, not acknowledged, but real. The desert took all of it with its characteristic patience. The mountains kept their distance. The lake bed remained flat and pale and ready for whatever needed to use it next. Section 6. Francis Gary Powers and the Day the U-2 Fell. May 1, 1960. In Moscow, the traditional May Day military parade was being prepared for Red Square. Tanks and missiles and rows of marching soldiers communicating, as they did every year, the state's power and permanence. Far to the southeast, at roughly the same hour, a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft climbed through the atmosphere over Pakistan, heading north toward the interior of the Soviet Union. The pilot was Francis Gary Powers, who had been flying these missions for roughly 4 years. The mission was designated Operation Grand Slam, one of the most ambitious overflights ever planned, a route that would take the aircraft from Pakistan north across the Soviet Union, photographing targets including missile test sites and industrial facilities before landing in Norway. Over the city of Sverdlovsk, deep in the Ural Mountains region, something happened that nobody in the program had fully prepared for.
The Soviet SA-2 surface-to-air missile system had been improving, quietly, systematically, with specific attention to the altitude problem that had kept it from threatening the U-2 on previous overflights. On May 1, a battery of SA-2 missiles launched against the aircraft. The first missile did not score a direct hit, but it exploded close enough to cause critical damage. The aircraft broke up at altitude. Powers survived. He bailed out or was thrown clear. The exact sequence was never fully established, and came down by parachute onto Soviet soil. He was alive. He was in the Soviet Union. He was surrounded, almost immediately, by Soviet citizens who had watched an aircraft fall from the sky, and then by Soviet military and intelligence personnel with professional interest in his arrival. The aircraft's self-destruct mechanism was not activated in time. The aircraft went down largely intact. The cameras and film were recoverable. The Eisenhower administration, believing initially that the pilot had not survived and that the Soviets had only wreckage to work with, deployed a cover story. NASA had prepared documentation in advance for exactly this contingency. A civilian weather research aircraft, operating for scientific purposes, had gone missing over Turkey after its pilot reported oxygen equipment trouble. Nikita Khrushchev stood before the Supreme Soviet. He announced that an American spy aircraft had been shot down over Soviet territory. The pilot was alive and in Soviet custody. The wreckage had been recovered. The photographs in the cameras showed the mission's purpose beyond any possible misinterpretation. He produced the wreckage photographs. He produced Powers himself to stand trial.
The cover story collapsed. Eisenhower, with a directness that history has generally viewed with some respect, did not reach for a more elaborate lie. He acknowledged the overflights. He said they had been necessary, that the Soviet Union's refusal to allow the mutual inspection and transparency the United States had proposed left aerial reconnaissance as the only practical means of obtaining vital intelligence. The consequences were immediate. A summit meeting in Paris between Eisenhower and Khrushchev, scheduled for May 16th and carrying genuine hopes for progress on arms control, was destroyed before it began. Khrushchev demanded a formal apology, was refused, and withdrew. Whatever might have been achieved at that summit was gone. Powers was convicted of espionage in a Moscow trial and sentenced to 10 years. He served roughly 21 months before being exchanged in February 1962 on the Glienicke Bridge in West Berlin for Soviet intelligence officer Rudolf Abel. The exchange on the bridge, two figures walking from opposite ends toward the center, became one of the Cold War's most charged images, recreated in novels and films for decades. For Area 51, the incident was a threshold. The U-2 overflights of the Soviet Union were suspended and not resumed. The aircraft continued to fly missions over other territories, but the specific mission for which the base had been built was foreclosed by the demonstrated improvement in Soviet air defense technology. The engineers working on what would replace the U-2 found their urgency sharpened considerably. Whatever came next needed to fly faster and higher than any missile could follow. In the hangars at Groom Lake, already past the drawing board stage, something was being assembled that would make the U-2 look, in retrospect, like a first tentative experiment in what was actually possible.
In Kelly Johnson's notebooks, in the years 1956 through 1959, a design went through iterations numbered like a private code. Archangel 1, then 2, then 3, each version addressing the engineering problems the previous one had exposed, each one narrowing towards something that satisfied the mission requirements without disintegrating in the process or killing the pilot. By Archangel 12, the design had reached what Johnson believed was close to the limit of what physics would permit. The CIA agreed and awarded Lockheed a contract in 1959. The program was codenamed Oxcart. The Archangel 12, officially the A-12, was unlike anything that had flown before it or has flown operationally since. The mission requirements were these: cruise at Mach 3.2, meaning 3.2 times the speed of sound, or roughly 2,000 miles per hour. Sustain this speed at an altitude of 90,000 feet. Do this for hours at a time while carrying cameras capable of photographing ground targets at useful resolution from that altitude, and reduce the aircraft's radar signature to the point where Soviet radar systems would struggle to track it with the precision required to guide weapons against it. Each of those requirements alone would have been a serious engineering challenge. Together, they constituted a design problem at the frontier of everything known about aerodynamics, materials science, thermodynamics, and propulsion. The solution required inventing technologies that did not yet exist.
At Mach 3.2, aerodynamic heating raises the temperature of an aircraft's skin to levels that cause conventional aluminum alloys to soften and lose structural integrity. Aluminum, the dominant construction material for aircraft at that time and still today, could not function at these temperatures for sustained periods. Johnson's solution was titanium, a metal that retains its strength at high temperatures and is significantly lighter than steel. The problem was that in the late 1950s, titanium was a relatively immature engineering material. The techniques for machining it precisely, welding it cleanly, and forming it into complex shapes had not been developed to any useful industrial level. The engineers at Skunk Works essentially had to invent titanium fabrication technology as they built the aircraft that required it. The supply chain for this titanium contained an irony that reads almost like fiction. The primary source of the world's titanium ore in the late 1950s was the Soviet Union. The CIA, through a network of front companies and carefully obscured procurement channels, was purchasing large quantities of Soviet titanium in order to build the aircraft designed to spy on the Soviet Union. Whether Soviet intelligence ever noticed the unusual pattern of purchases and connected them to a classified American aerospace program is not recorded in any document that has been publicly released.
The propulsion system presented its own challenges. The two Pratt & Whitney J-58 engines that powered the production aircraft each produced more than 30,000 pounds of thrust. At Mach 3, conventional turbojet cycles become thermodynamically inefficient, and the J-58 was designed to transition at high speeds to a hybrid cycle that was simultaneously turbojet and something resembling a ramjet, a different fundamental approach to generating thrust that becomes practical only at very high speeds. The fuel itself was a classified development. Standard jet fuel would ignite spontaneously at the temperatures the A-12 experienced. A specialized formulation designated JP7 was developed, a hydrocarbon fuel with a flash point high enough to remain stable in near hypersonic thermal conditions. The aircraft that resulted from all this engineering was a thing of severe, sparse beauty.
low and narrow, tapering sharply at the nose, the fuselage blending into its delta wings with an organic continuity. Painted in black that was partly aesthetic and partly functional, formulated to absorb radar energy and to radiate the thermal energy that Mark III crews constantly deposited in the airframe structure. The A-12 made its first official flight on April 30th, 1962, from the runway at Groom Lake. Test pilot Lou Shark had actually lifted the aircraft briefly off the ground 4 days earlier during a high-speed taxi test. The aircraft had essentially decided it was ready to fly before the test schedule had planned for it. The April 30 mission began a flight test program that would push the aircraft and the people who flew and maintained it to limits that had not previously existed.
At cruising speed and altitude, the A-12 could cover 70 miles of ground per minute. It could cross the continental United States in roughly 70 minutes. The cameras it carried could photograph a strip of territory more than 4,000 miles long in a single mission, resolving objects with dimensions measured in inches from 13 miles above the ground. The SR-71 Blackbird, developed as a two-seat derivative of the A-12 and entering Air Force service while the CIA's A-12 fleet remained classified, eventually set a speed record on July 28, 1976, Mach 3.3, or 2,193 miles per hour in level flight. This record has never been broken by an air-breathing aircraft in sustained level flight. The SR-71 was retired in 1990, still the fastest thing that has ever operated regularly from a military airfield. At altitude, in the titanium aircraft moving at 3 times the speed of sound, pilots could see stars in daylight, the sky above them shaded to the deep violet black of the upper atmosphere, the horizon below curved visibly. The silence was the particular silence of very high speed at the edge of the atmosphere, the engines attenuated by thin air, the sensation of velocity strangely subdued when there is nothing to rush past. Some pilots described the experience with words that belonged more naturally to poetry than to technical reports. The speed and the silence together, the curved world below, the sense of existing at the edge of everything that the atmosphere contained. Section 8. The UFO problem. Here is a thing that is documented, verified, included in the CIA's own declassified records, and worse approaching slowly.
The United States government in the 1950s and continuing through the 1960s had an implicit policy about unexplained aerial sightings. When civilians and commercial pilots reported seeing strange aircraft that did not match any known design, that flew at extraordinary altitudes or moved in ways that no known aircraft could, the government did not explain what those aircraft were. It could not. Explaining them would have compromised classified programs whose existence could not be publicly acknowledged. So the sightings were officially filed as unidentified, which was, in a narrow technical sense, accurate. They were genuinely unidentified to the people receiving the reports, because those people were not clear to know what they were. The CIA's declassified history of the U-2 program states explicitly that U-2 flights during the late 1950s and early 1960s caused what it describes as a tremendous increase in reports of unidentified flying objects. It notes that the aircraft's highly polished silver finish made it visible from the ground during times when the sun illuminated the aircraft at altitude, while the observers below were already in shadow. To a commercial airline pilot looking at and seeing a smooth silver shape moving steadily at an altitude of 65,000 feet with no contrail, no sound, no identifying characteristics, the experience was genuinely puzzling. Nothing in their operational knowledge accounted for it.
When they reported it, the reports went to air traffic control, which had no explanation, and then to military investigators, who did have the explanation, but were not cleared to provide it.
The Air Force was simultaneously running Project Blue Book, its official investigation of UFO reports. Blue Book investigators received these sightings and attempted to categorize them. For the sightings caused by classified aircraft operations, they had no explanation they were permitted to give. So the reports were filed as unexplained, attributed to atmospheric phenomena, or tagged as probable misidentification of conventional aircraft, whatever explanation was least obviously wrong given what could be said. Roger Launius, a historian and former curator at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, captured the dynamic precisely. From the Air Force's perspective, having people believe in alien spacecraft was operationally preferable to revealing the truth about classified reconnaissance programs. The alien narrative was vaguely embarrassing but harmless. The true explanation was diplomatically dangerous in specific and immediate ways. This was a deliberate choice to leave mystery unresolved rather than resolve it at the cost of operational security. In its narrow immediate terms, the choice was defensible. In its longer-term cultural terms, it planted something that grew into a phenomenon far larger than anyone involved in making that choice could have anticipated. What the choice did not account for was the cumulative weight of decades of official mystery. Each unexplained sighting filed as unidentified added another point to a growing body of evidence that the government was hiding something. Each denial added another layer of documented official deception. Each eventual confirmation that yes, there had been secret aircraft, that the denials had been deliberate, that the investigators had known more than they said, taught people something about the government's relationship with the truth. It taught them that the relationship was managed, that what was officially denied might simply be what had not yet been officially admitted. The connection between Area 51 and extraterrestrial technology was not firmly established in popular imagination until 1989. But the soil in which that connection would take root had been prepared by 30 years of real secrecy about real programs, and the resulting mythology was, in a specific sense, the natural product of a system that told people less than they needed to know for long enough that they had to begin inventing their own answers. The sky above Nevada was strange. It continues to be strange. Aircraft that the public does not know about continue to fly test missions in restricted airspace. The sightings continue. The official answers continue to be as limited as the classification structure requires. The relationship between the UFO mythology and the documented history of Area 51 is not one of simple confirmation or refutation. It is one of genuine mutual entanglement, a mythology that grew in the space created by real secrecy, that became so culturally embedded it outlasted the secrecy that created it, and that now persists on its own momentum, shaped by human needs that have nothing to do with aircraft classification levels. Section 9. MiGs in the Desert. There is a chapter in the history of Area 51 that receives less attention than the spy planes and the UFO theories, but which says something equally interesting about what secret places are actually used for.
During the Cold War, the United States military had a persistent and urgent need to understand the aircraft it might face in combat. Knowing the exact performance envelope of a Soviet MiG fighter jet, its maximum speed, its sustained climb rate, its turning radius at various altitudes and airspeeds, the quirks of its engine behavior at its limits, was information of immediate and specific tactical value to every American pilot who might encounter one. In a dogfight, the pilot who genuinely understands the opposing aircraft has an advantage that can translate directly into coming home rather than not.
The problem was access. Photographs and estimated performance specifications derived from intelligence sources were useful but limited. The difference between knowing an aircraft's estimated ceiling and actually flying against one to learn where it begins to lose energy and authority at altitude, that difference was the difference between a map of a city and having walked its streets in the rain. Through various covert channels, some of which are described in declassified documents only in general enough to describe process without identifying sources, the United States acquired Soviet-built MiG fighters during the 1960s. Some came from defectors, pilots who flew their aircraft to friendly airfields in Allied countries. Some came from Allied nations in the Middle East that had received Soviet aircraft and could be persuaded, with appropriate diplomatic or financial encouragement, to allow American engineers extended access to them.
The aircraft were brought to Groom Lake. In the controlled environment of the restricted airspace over the Nevada basin, American pilots flew them against American aircraft in mock combat, flew them against radar systems being developed for American missiles to characterize the radar return signatures that American air defense systems would need to identify, mapped their performance across the full operational envelope, the speeds and altitudes and maneuver combinations that revealed the aircraft's true characteristics rather than its theoretical ones. The programs had names with a quality of deliberate lightness. Have Donut was the evaluation of a MiG-21, a capable Soviet Delta Wing fighter, conducted in early 1968. Have Drill involved a MiG-17, an older but operationally significant Soviet design, beginning in February 1969. The aircraft flew 172 sorties over 55 days. Have Ferry, the companion program, flew 52 sorties over 20 days. Between the three programs, the amount of operational data gathered about Soviet aircraft exceeded what any other method available at the time could have produced. The tactical findings were distributed through classified channels to American fighter units. Specific vulnerabilities were documented, approach angles from which the MiG-21's radar-guided missiles were ineffective, speed regimes in which the aircraft's maneuverability advantage over the American F-4 Phantom diminished significantly, altitude bands in which American aircraft held superior energy retention. Pilots trained against the acquired MiGs developed an understanding of their opponent's aircraft that was fundamentally different from anything obtainable from a classified briefing based on estimated performance.
The contribution to American air combat effectiveness in the later phases of the Vietnam War and in subsequent conflicts was real and measurable, even if it cannot be precisely isolated from the many other factors that affected outcomes. The people who ran the programs and the pilots who trained in them believed the contribution was substantial. The declassified records support the belief. The logistics of maintaining Soviet aircraft at an American base had a quality of improvisation that people who worked on the programs later described with genuine affection. Maintenance manuals were in Russian, and not all mechanics assigned to the work were Russian readers, which required translation under time pressure and security constraints simultaneously. Spare parts were not available through normal supply channels. Certain mechanical characteristics of Soviet engines and airframes were unfamiliar to technicians trained entirely on American equipment. The pilots who flew the MiGs, American pilots, in Soviet aircraft, in classified airspace, against American aircraft that officially also were not there, occupied a peculiar position, even within the already peculiar context of Area 51. Their cover stories, prepared for the unlikely but possible eventuality of needing to interact with outside authorities during an emergency, were exercises in technically accurate vagueness. They worked for the government. They flew in Nevada. The details were not available for discussion. The desert held all of this with the same patience it held everything else.
Foreign aircraft on the ramp in the morning light, their Soviet markings painted over, surrounded by American mechanics learning the contours of an adversary's engineering. One of the stranger images of the Cold War, mostly unphotographed, held inside the fence. Section 10. Stealth, the next revolution.
Somewhere in the archives of the Air Force Foreign Technology Division, in the early 1970s, a translated technical paper was moving through channels with a quiet and gathering significance. The paper had been written in 1962 by a Soviet physicist named Pyotr Umfimtsev, published in a Soviet scientific journal in a form accessible to anyone reading the right literature in Russian. It was a theoretical work on the behavior of electromagnetic waves when they encountered surfaces of various geometric configurations, mathematical, abstract, dense with specialized notation, not immediately obvious in its practical implications to anyone not thinking specifically about radar. To engineers who were thinking specifically about radar, however, about designing aircraft that radar could not easily detect, Umfimtsev's paper provided something that had not previously existed in this form, a mathematical framework for calculating with precision how radar energy would reflect off a surface of a given shape, which meant in principle that if you could compute the reflection, you could design the surface to minimize it. You could calculate a shape for an aircraft that would return so little radar energy that the aircraft would be, for practical purposes, invisible to the systems trying to find it. The Advanced Research Projects Agency, the government organization charged with pursuing advanced technology that did not fit conventional research categories, began work on the problem in the early 1970s under a project called Have Blue. 2 experimental aircraft were built and tested. The first flight took place at Groom Lake in April 1977.
The Have Blue aircraft were visually startling. They were composed entirely of flat facets, flat triangular and trapezoidal panels arranged at precise angles to one another, with no smooth curves anywhere in the design. A smooth curve produces a better understood aerodynamic form, but generates more complex and less predictable radar reflections than a flat plane. The engineers chose to work within the computational constraints available to them by designing an aircraft that was essentially a collection of carefully angled flat surfaces, each one positioned to deflect radar energy away from the source rather than back toward it. The result looked like aggressive origami, a diamond-shaped platform, angular and severe, bearing no resemblance to any conventional aircraft. It was, in the normal aerodynamic sense, deeply unstable. The flat facets that managed its radar reflection did not produce natural aerodynamic stability. Left to its own devices in the air, the aircraft would immediately diverge from any controlled path in ways no pilot could correct manually. What made flight possible was a fly-by-wire control system, a digital computer monitoring the aircraft's attitude and flight parameters many times per second and making continuous small corrections to the control surfaces to maintain whatever attitude and path the pilot commanded. Without the computer, the aircraft fell out of the sky. With it, the aircraft flew, strangely and deliberately. The radar cross-section measurements were extraordinary. The Have Blue aircraft, measured from head-on, returned a radar signal equivalent to a small bird. For an aircraft physically the size of a jet fighter, this was astonishing. The radar systems of the 1970s, designed to detect aircraft at ranges of hundreds of miles, simply could not find it at operationally meaningful distances. The Air Force initiated a production program designated Senior Trend in November 1978. The production aircraft, the F-117 Nighthawk, was built and tested at Area 51.
Its existence was classified for years after it entered operational service in October 1983. The unit that flew it trained, maintained readiness, and was incorporated into operational planning for potential conflicts, all while the aircraft's existence was officially denied by the United States government. Thousands of people knew about it. Pilots flew it, mechanics maintained it, logistics staff supported it, intelligence analysts incorporated its capabilities into their assessments. All of them kept the secret for more than 5 years. When the F-117's existence was acknowledged in November 1988, the announcement included photographs that showed the public for the first time what stealth looked like from the outside. The faceted angles, the deep black paint, the profile unlike anything they had seen. The response was a mixture of genuine wonder and the particular satisfaction of having something confirmed that had long been suspected. The aircraft flew in combat for the first time in December 1989 during the American invasion of Panama. Its major operational debut came in January 1991 when F-117s flew the opening night strikes of Operation Desert Storm against targets in Baghdad, among the most heavily defended airspace in the world, protected by thousands of radar-guided anti-aircraft systems designed and positioned to shoot down attacking aircraft. The F-117s flew through these defenses repeatedly. Not a single aircraft was lost to enemy fire during Desert Storm.
The technology that made this possible traced a direct line back through the Nevada desert to the flat-faceted experimental aircraft at Groom Lake, to the translated paper of a Soviet physicist, to the decades of classified engineering done in hangars at the base since 1955. A Russian mathematician's theoretical work from 1962, translated by the American Air Force and given to American engineers, had become one of the most effective weapons in American military aviation. Ufimtsev himself eventually came to the United States and worked as a professor at UCLA. He was, by accounts, quietly amused to learn the extent to which his theoretical paper had shaped American military history. Section 10b. The Workers Who Vanished into Nevada. There is a detail about the history of Area 51 that does not appear in the official declassifications and is rarely addressed in the documentaries and books that have proliferated around the subject. It is not a dramatic secret, it is simply a human one. The people who worked at the base for the most intense decades of its operation, the 1950s, 1960s and 1970s, carried the weight of what they had done into their retirements and eventually into their deaths without ever being able to talk about it. In many cases, their families buried them without knowing what they had actually spent their careers doing. The neighbors who attended the funeral services knew only that the person had worked for the government, somewhere in Nevada, on something they couldn't discuss.
This was not unique to Area 51. The Cold War produced thousands of people who worked on classified programs, nuclear weapons design, cryptography, intelligence analysis, signals interception, and who maintained their secrecy through long careers, long retirements, and long declines into old age. The culture of non-disclosure that the national security apparatus cultivated in the post-war decades was thorough and durable. People who had signed their names to non-disclosure agreements in the early 1950s were still honoring those agreements 40 years later, even when the programs they had worked on had been declassified in principle, and even when the people who could have punished them for disclosure had themselves long since retired or died. At Area 51, this silence had a particular texture because the nature of the work was so visually and experientially striking. A cryptographer who spent 40 years analyzing signals in a basement facility could perhaps manage the weight of that silence by the relative abstraction of the work. But a mechanic who had spent years maintaining the A-12, who had put their hands on titanium panels heated to temperatures that human skin could not touch without gloves, who had watched that aircraft climb away from the Nevada lake bed at an angle that still seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't seen it, that person had an experience to carry, a specific, vivid, tactile experience of having touched something extraordinary.
There are accounts gathered in the years after the declassifications began from family members of workers who had died. A daughter who discovered, while going through her father's papers after his death, that he had apparently kept a private journal that made cryptic references to aircraft she did not recognize and places that she had been told were in Nevada, but whose actual names were unfamiliar to her. A son who remembered his father becoming unusually agitated every time a television program about UFOs was broadcast in the family living room. Not dismissive, not mockingly skeptical, but visibly uncomfortable in a way that his son had noticed but never been able to ask about.
What they described in these late-life testimonies was not sensational, it was specific. The names of aircraft they had maintained, the characteristics of the runway surface in different seasons, the layout of the hangars in the early years before the base expanded, the quality of the cafeteria food, which came up repeatedly with a kind of wry emphasis that suggested it had been a source of sustained low-level suffering. The particular character of the Nevada summer heat, which was unlike heat in most places because it was so dry and so bright and so complete. They described the community, the sense of shared purpose, the friendships formed in a place where ordinary conversation was restricted, and so the friendship had to be built in other ways, through shared meals and evening card games, and the particular humor that develops among people doing something they cannot explain to anyone outside. Some of them described the sky, the Nevada sky above the basin, which was darker and clearer and more densely starred than anything they had experienced before or since. They described standing outside the hangars in the night air after a long shift and looking up, and how the stars were so numerous and so close that the sky seemed more solid than the dark landscape below it. They described how sometimes, on clear nights, you could watch one of the aircraft you had spent the day maintaining become a moving point of light against that sky, climbing higher and faster than anything else, disappearing into an altitude that the naked eye could no longer track.
Some of them cried when they spoke about it. Not from grief, they said, from something that was harder to name. The combination of pride and loss that comes from having been part of something that mattered, and having held that thing in silence for so long, and then finally being able to say, I was there, that was real, I helped make that. This is the human texture of Area 51 that gets lost in the mythology, not the alien spacecraft and the crash retrievals and the reverse engineering, the ordinary, extraordinary life of people who built and maintained the most remarkable aircraft in the world in a desert they had been told not to describe, for a country that would not officially acknowledge they had been there. Their silence was itself a form of service, and their eventual testimony, when it came, was a kind of homecoming. Section 11. Bob Lazar and the Birth of a Legend. May 1989, Las Vegas. A man has agreed to be interviewed by a television news reporter named George Knapp at KLAS, a local news station. The man appears on camera with his face obscured, identified only as Dennis. He speaks carefully, with the specific precision of someone who has decided exactly what he will say and is managing the boundary between that and everything he will not. He describes himself as a physicist. He says he has worked at a classified subsite near Area 51, a location he calls S4, positioned several miles south of the main Groom Lake facility. He says the work being done at S4 is unlike anything conducted at any known government facility. He says the work involves alien spacecraft. His name is Robert Scott Lazar. He says he was employed to assist with the reverse engineering of one of 9 flying saucers of non-human manufacture held at S4. He describes their propulsion system as operating on an element he calls element 115, a substance that produces a gravity wave when bombarded with protons in a specific way, and that this gravity wave is the mechanism of flight for the craft. He says he personally worked on one of the 9 craft, which he refers to as the sport model. He says he viewed photographs of biological entities of non-human origin. He says briefing documents he was required to read described 10,000 years of alien involvement in human history. Lazar subsequently appeared in follow-up interviews, eventually under his own name, and became a public figure of considerable visibility. He took a small group to a location outside the restricted area, where on multiple evenings they observed lights performing maneuvers in the restricted airspace that he said were consistent with the craft being test-flown. The questions about Lazar himself began almost immediately. His claimed educational credentials, including degrees from MIT and Caltech, could not be verified. Neither institution had enrollment records matching his stated attendance. His claimed employment at Los Alamos National Laboratory was initially denied by the laboratory, though documents later surfaced showing his name in a facility phone directory, suggesting some connection of uncertain nature. His claimed employment at the S4 facility produced no verifiable documentation from any source. In 1990, he was convicted of felony pandering. In 2006, he pleaded no contest to charges related to the illegal sale of chemical compounds. Neither of these convictions speaks directly to the truth of his Area 51 claims, but they contributed to a biographical picture that made conventional credibility assessment difficult. His claims about element 115 became a point of particular discussion when the element was officially added to the periodic table in 2016 under the name moscovium. Some supporters argued this confirmed Lazar had known about the element decades before its official discovery. Skeptics noted that the properties Lazar described for his element 115 do not match the measured properties of moscovium. The element exists, it does not behave as Lazar described. Bob Lazar has maintained his account with consistency across more than 35 years of sustained public attention. A 2018 Netflix documentary revisited him at length. He appeared on major podcasts, reaching audiences of millions. He has not substantially changed his story in the ways that fabricated accounts tend to erode on the sustained scrutiny. He has also not provided physical evidence supporting his claims. What can be said with confidence is this: Lazar's 1989 television interview marked a specific and identifiable inflection point in the cultural mythology of Area 51. Before that interview, the base was known primarily to aviation researchers, some journalists, and the local population of southern Nevada. After that interview, Area 51 entered the mainstream popular imagination as a location specifically associated with alien technology and government concealment of extraterrestrial contact. The interview planted a narrative that the culture was ready and waiting to receive.
The Independence Day film in 1996 depicted Area 51 as the storage location for alien technology and reached audiences of hundreds of millions. The X-Files television series, running from 1993 to 2002 and defining its cultural moment, drew on the same framework. The fictional identity of the base became for many people more vivid and more present than its factual one. Why did Lazar's story catch so completely? Part of it was timing. 1989 was a moment of accumulated turbulence in American trust in government. The Cold War was visibly ending, which raised questions about what had been done in its name. The Iran-Contra scandal was still present in public memory. The decades since Vietnam and Watergate had produced a settled expectation that governments routinely deceive about important things. If official denials could be false about those things, they could be false about this. Part of it was the genuine strangeness of Area 51 itself. By 1989, the base's existence was visible in satellite imagery, and its extreme security measures were known to people who had tried to approach it. Here was a place ringed by lethal force warnings, a place the government had never formally acknowledged, a place that was self-evidently being used for something. Bob Lazar provided an explanation for what that something was. And part of it was the enduring human desire to not be alone in the universe, that the vast and mostly silent cosmos has sent something our way, that the government, in its secrecy, is hiding not only weapons, but wonders.
Whether Lazar told the truth, whether he experienced something real that he misunderstood, whether some more complicated combination of things applies, the record cannot settle these questions. What it shows clearly is that real secrecy, combined with specific and detailed claims, produced a mythology so culturally embedded that it has outlasted every attempt at correction. The desert maintains its silence on this point, as it maintains its silence on all points. Section 11b, the contractors, the casinos, and the commute from Las Vegas. There is a geography to the secrecy of Area 51 that is worth understanding, because it shaped the daily lives of the people who worked there in ways both practical and strange. Las Vegas, which sits roughly 83 miles southwest of Groom Lake, was the nearest significant city. And Las Vegas in the 1960s and 1970s was a city that had already developed a particular relationship with the peculiar and the unspoken. A city where what happened here stayed here was not merely a tourism marketing slogan, but a genuine civic philosophy, an understanding built into the culture by decades of gambling, entertainment, and the various associated industries that a city without strong inhibitions tends to accumulate.
For the workers at Area 51, Las Vegas served multiple functions. It was, most practically, the location of McCarran Airport, from which the Janet Airlines flights departed. The unmarked terminal, a restricted section of the commercial airport, accessible only to credentialed workers, was where the working week began and ended. Workers would arrive at the terminal on Monday mornings, pass through security checks, board the unmarked aircraft, and arrive at the base 45 minutes later. They would return on Friday afternoons. Or they wouldn't, because some operational periods kept workers on site for weeks at a time. But Las Vegas was also where many workers lived with their families in the ordinary suburban neighborhoods that were spreading across the desert south and east of the Strip in those decades. Houses in Henderson, apartments in North Las Vegas, ranch-style homes in what were then new developments with fresh landscaping fighting against the desert heat. workers who commuted to a classified base from a house on a cul-de-sac, who coached Little League on weekends and attended neighborhood barbecues and sent their children to public school, and who would tell anyone who asked that they worked for a government contractor in Nevada.
The contractor culture around the base was itself an interesting ecology. Major aerospace and defense companies maintained a presence in the Las Vegas area partly because of the base and partly because of the broader Nevada test range infrastructure. Lockheed had employees in the region. EG&G, a major government contractor that handled a wide range of technical services at classified sites, was headquartered in Las Vegas for much of the base's most active period, and was for many years the primary contractor through which civilian workers at Area 51 were employed. EG&G's presence in Las Vegas was known, and its connection to classified government work was known, but the specific work it performed, for whom, at what locations, was not something that was discussed in the company's public-facing communications. The casino culture of Las Vegas had an unexpected relevance to all of this. Las Vegas in those decades was a city deeply practiced in the art of not asking questions. The casino floor was a place where identities were flexible, where the past week was less important than the present hand of cards, where a man who worked on something he couldn't describe was indistinguishable from a salesman who traveled a lot and preferred not to discuss his marriage. The social norms of the city ran naturally parallel to the professional norms of the classified workforce. You were who you said you were doing what you said you were doing. Nobody pressed.
This was useful in ways that the program managers probably appreciated without explicitly planning for. Workers who needed to unwind after weeks on a base in the middle of nowhere could do so in a city that was built for unwinding, that offered entertainment and anonymity and the particular freedom of a place where everyone was in some sense from somewhere else, and no one was keeping careful track. The stress of sustained secrecy could be metabolized, at least partially, in an environment that did not require explanation. There were also the practical connections between the base and the city that were visible enough to attentive observers to generate their own rumors. The Janet Airlines flights, departing from a walled-off section of the commercial airport, were visible from the main terminal if you knew where to look. White aircraft with a single red stripe, no airline markings, taxiing out on a schedule that bore no relationship to any published flight timetable. Aviation enthusiasts who monitored flight activity noticed them. People who worked at the airport noticed them. The flights were referred to obliquely in local conversations, not discussed exactly, but acknowledged in the way that things are acknowledged in a place that understands discretion. Families of workers who lived in Las Vegas developed their own informal networks of mutual understanding. The spouses of people working at the base knew each other, often without being entirely sure what the other's husbands or wives did, just that they disappeared on similar schedules and returned with similar reticence and similar expressions of someone carrying something they had set down for the weekend. This shared experience created a kind of community, unspoken and loosely defined, among people who could not directly discuss the source of their common bond. Some of these families lived with the arrangement for years without significant difficulty. Others found it harder. The not knowing was difficult, but perhaps more difficult was the knowing that there was knowing, being aware that your partner had a significant professional life that was completely inaccessible to you, that they came home changed in ways you couldn't directly address because the source of the change was classified. The children of these families sometimes describe their childhoods as ordinary in almost every way, with a single unexplained absence at the center. Their parents were present, involved, functionally normal in all the ways that family life requires. The missing piece was simply this:
You did not know what your parent did all day, and asking was not something you did, because the answer was always a version of, "I work for the government," and the steadiness with which that answer was given communicated that the question was not going to be answered differently. When those children grew up and the declassifications began, some of them finally learned what their parents had actually spent those years doing. The reactions from those who have spoken about them ranged from pride to a complicated mix of understanding and something like gentle grief. Grief for the conversations that could not be had, the explanations that could not be given, the shared pride that had to wait decades to be possible. The secrecy was necessary, it was real, and it cost things that do not appear in any official accounting. Section 12. The Government's Long Silence and the 2013 Admission. For decades, the United States government maintained, with a consistency that was itself a kind of achievement, that it had nothing formal to say about a place called Area 51.
Presidential spokespersons were asked about it. State Department officials were asked. Congress was asked. The answers, on the rare occasions they came at all, were carefully worded arrangements of language that acknowledged geography without confirming facilities, referenced security requirements without specifying what was being secured, and conveyed in their very craftsmanship the presence of something too deliberate to be simple ignorance. President Bill Clinton, in a 1995 executive order, included language acknowledging an operating location in the vicinity of Groom Lake, Nevada, while simultaneously exempting that location from certain environmental oversight requirements. The exemption was necessary because former workers at the base had filed lawsuits claiming exposure to toxic materials resulting from the burning of classified equipment. They alleged they had been exposed without adequate protection or disclosure. The government's response was to exempt the facility from the legal process that would have required full disclosure. The logical implication that you cannot exempt from legal process a facility that does not officially exist was noted by legal observers. President George W. Bush renewed similar exemptions in subsequent years. The governmental position settled into something close to, "We cannot confirm or deny this, but we need you to sign a document acknowledging it is exempt from regulations that would otherwise apply."
The National Security Archive at George Washington University had been pursuing the history of the U2 and Oakscart programs through Freedom of Information Act requests since the late 1990s. Senior fellow Jeffrey Richelson reviewed a version of the CIA's internal program history in 2002 and found every reference to Area 51 had been redacted, blacked out with the specific density of government redaction ink, leaving visible gaps where meaningful words had been removed. The places where the base's name should have appeared were conspicuous in their absence, like a sentence with its subject carefully excised. Richelson filed a new FOIA request in 2005, specifically targeting the redacted material and arguing that the passage of time and the changed security environment supported declassification review. In August 2013, the CIA released a version of the document with the Area 51 references restored. It was, formally, officially, in the record, the first government document to use the name Area 51 in unredacted text, to confirm the facility's location at Groom Lake, and to describe its use for specific classified aviation programs. The document described the site's acquisition in 1955. It described the U2 program. It described the Oakscart program. It placed the base on a map. The media coverage was substantial. The phrase "officially acknowledged" appeared in headlines around the world. People who had been following the subject for decades found their long-held certainties confirmed in black ink. What the document did not contain was any mention of extraterrestrial technology, alien biology, or reverse engineering programs. The declassified history was a document about Cold War aviation, remarkable aircraft, remarkable people, extraordinary human engineering conducted in extraordinary secrecy.
The reaction in the UFO research community was divided in the way it had always been divided. Some took the disclosure at face value. This is what was there, this is what was done. The secrecy was about aircraft. Others took it as a controlled release, the acknowledgement of the known programs as cover for the continued concealment of what remained classified. If the government could hide the U-2 for years, it could hide something else longer. Both interpretations were available. Both remain available. What the 2013 disclosure accomplished definitively was to close the chapter of official non-acknowledgement. The base existed. Its name was in CIA records. Its location was confirmed. Whatever else might be true about its history, the basic architecture of the official story was no longer deniable. The base continued to operate. The satellite imagery changed periodically, new construction appearing between observation windows, suggesting ongoing programmatic investment of some kind. The white trucks on the ridgelines remained. The restricted airspace over Groom Lake remained restricted. The desert remained, patient, flat, enormously old. Section 13. Storm Area 51, when the Internet went to the desert. June 27, 2019. A 20-year-old student from rural Nevada named Matty Roberts created a Facebook event. He titled it, Storm Area 51, They Can't Stop All of Us. The description was written in the register of cheerful internet absurdity. It proposed that if enough people gathered simultaneously and charged the base while performing the Naruto run, a running style borrowed from a Japanese anime series, security personnel would be mathematically unable to stop all of them, and the assembled crowd would have a reasonable probability of locating the aliens.
Roberts expected perhaps 40 friends to click attending. He later said he gave no serious thought to what a serious gathering at Area 51 would look like in practice. Within 3 days, more than 1 million people had indicated they were going. Within a week, the number exceeded 2 million. Facebook groups associated with the event grew to several million members. The joke had escaped the confines of jokes and was becoming something the United States Air Force felt it needed to issue a formal statement about. The Air Force statement noted that Area 51 is an open training range for the United States Air Force, and that the Air Force would discourage anyone from trying to come into an area where they train American armed forces. The statement had a tone that struggled visibly with the gap between the event's inherent comedy and the genuinely serious security implications of 2 million people indicating they intended to approach a classified military installation. The statement chose seriousness. The Internet found this choice additionally funny. Roberts, who was now dealing with a viral phenomenon of a scale he had not anticipated, received calls from lawyers and journalists and people who wanted to turn the event into a real festival. He navigated in the subsequent weeks between his original joke and the earnest attention of millions of people who were partly joking and partly, in a way that was difficult to quantify but unmistakably present, genuinely curious about what was behind the fence.
Festival events were planned for Rachel, Nevada, and for the nearby community of Hyco. These were called variously Alien Stock and Storm Area 51 Base Camp. Music acts were booked, food vendors made arrangements. Local authorities in Lincoln County worked through the logistics of a region that had no portable sanitation services, no medical facilities, and no law enforcement capacity commensurate with the numbers being projected. The actual gathering in the third week of September 2019 was a fraction of the indicated interest. Somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 people came to the Rachel and Heiko areas over the course of the event. A handful of individuals approached the base's perimeter. They were detained by local law enforcement and released. No security perimeter was breached, no aliens were encountered. What happened in Rachel was, by accounts from people who attended, rather pleasant in the particular way of unlikely gatherings of people who share an enthusiasm they can only half explain. There were alien costumes of varying elaborateness. There were handmade signs displaying ranges of wit. There was a woman who ran the Naruto run in front of a cluster of cameras and became briefly famous. There was music and the quiet camaraderie of strangers who had all made the same unlikely journey to the same unlikely place at the same unlikely hour. The little alien was overwhelmed in the best and worst senses simultaneously. Overwhelmed with customers, overwhelmed with the logistics of feeding hundreds of people at a facility that normally served dozens. The staff managed it with the composure of people who live in the Nevada desert and are accustomed to the unexpected.
What the Storm Area 51 phenomenon revealed about Area 51's cultural position in 2019 was interesting. It was simultaneously a sincere object of curiosity and a self-aware comedy, simultaneously a genuine conspiracy theory location and a meme. The people who came were not all believers in alien contact. Many were there because the joke was good and the desert was beautiful, and standing at the edge of something forbidden had its own appeal regardless of what was on the other side. The internet had given the mythology of Area 51 new dimensions. It had made the mystery participatory in a way it had never previously been. You could not crack the secret, but you could Naruto run toward it in front of a live camera, and if enough people found that funny, the moment would be documented and shared and remembered. The base, behind its fence, observed all of this with the institutional impassivity it has always maintained. The trucks on the ridgeline watched the gathering on the highway and watched it disperse. The lights moved in the restricted sky above, and no one on the public road could say with certainty what they were. Section 14. What Area 51 is today. The base at Groom Lake continues to operate. This is not speculation. Commercial satellite imagery, available to any subscriber of several mapping and imagery services, shows the base in sufficient resolution to observe its general configuration and track changes over time. The runways are long, well maintained, and show evidence of regular use. New construction has been observed periodically, appearing between imagery captures in ways suggesting ongoing investment in facilities. The hangars along the flight line are enormous, large enough to shelter aircraft of considerable scale and unusual configuration.
What specific programs operate from Groom Lake today is genuinely unknown to the public. The classification structure protecting current programs is as robust as it has ever been, and the culture of secrecy at the facility has not visibly softened in response to the 2013 acknowledgement. That acknowledgement covered what was done there in the past. It said nothing about the present. What can be said with reasonable confidence, based on the unbroken historical pattern of the base's use, is that Area 51 continues to serve the function it has served since 1955, the testing and development of classified aviation technology. The chain of classified programs, U-2, A-12, stealth aircraft, and the programs that followed, was continuous. Aerospace engineering has not stopped advancing. There is no historical reason to expect that chain to have ended, and considerable circumstantial evidence in the satellite imagery to suggest it has not. Hypersonic aircraft, vehicles designed for sustained flight at 5 times the speed of sound or more, are an active area of development in American, Chinese, and Russian military aviation.
The United States has publicly acknowledged the existence of hypersonic development programs. The specific aircraft produced by those programs remain classified. Unmanned aerial vehicles of increasing capability and endurance have been developed over the past 2 decades. The most advanced of these also remain classified. A base with long runways in extreme security-restricted airspace, with half a century of institutional experience in classified aviation development, is precisely what you would want for testing aircraft of extraordinary capability that you cannot disclose to potential adversaries or to the public funding their development.
In 2023, the public conversation about unidentified aerial phenomena reached a level of official seriousness that was new in the history of this subject. Congressional hearings were convened. Intelligence officials testified. A former Air Force officer and intelligence official named David Grush testified under oath that he had personal knowledge of programs involving the retrieval of non-human craft and non-human biological materials. He said these programs had operated for decades and that their concealment involved illegal misappropriation of congressional oversight. Grush's testimony was earnest in its delivery and unsubstantiated in the public record. No documentation corroborating his specific claims has been made public. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, established by Congress to investigate UAP reports and allegations of hidden programs, published a historical review in 2024, finding no verified evidence of extraterrestrial technology or biological materials in any program it had access to examine. This does not settle the question. The review covered what it had access to, and the nature of what it did and did not have access to is itself a matter of classification. The pattern here is familiar. It is the pattern that has defined Area 51's entire history. The government acknowledges what it chooses to acknowledge. It declines to confirm or deny what it chooses not to confirm or deny. And the space between what is known and what remains unknown fills with human curiosity and human interpretation, and all the questions that the established facts do not answer. What is known? The base is real, operational, and historically associated with the most advanced classified aviation programs in American history. What remains unknown? The specific content of what it is doing today, and whether that content includes anything requiring fundamental revision of the categories through which human beings currently understand the universe.
The desert holds its patience. The mountains hold their distance. The long runways and the large hangars and the watching trucks on the ridgeline hold their silence. And somewhere in the restricted zone tonight, under those extraordinary Nevada stars, something is happening. Something that will not be disclosed until the declassification review process gets to it, decades from now, when it too will be revealed to have been extraordinary in ways that the conspiracy theories of today will have mostly missed. Section 14b. The UAP hearings and the return of old questions. The year 2023 brought something that had not quite happened before in the 70 years of Area 51's history. Serious, sustained, bipartisan congressional attention to the question of what the government knows about unidentified phenomena in American airspace, and whether that knowledge is being appropriately shared with the people's elected representatives. The hearings before the House Oversight Committee in July of that year were remarkable not for the answers they produced few, but for the questions they placed on the official record with an earnestness that previous decades had reserved mostly for the edges of political conversation. Ryan Graves, a former Navy pilot, testified about encounters with unidentified objects that his squadron had experienced repeatedly in restricted airspace.
He described objects that performed maneuvers inconsistent with any known aircraft, not moving impossibly fast exactly, but moving in ways that suggested either extraordinary technology or unusual physical properties. He described these encounters as routine in his squadron's experience, not aberrant, and said that the stigma associated with reporting such encounters discouraged pilots from formally documenting them.
David Fravor, another former Navy pilot, had previously given public testimony about the 2004 USS Nimitz encounter, which had become one of the more well-documented UAP cases in the public record. The Nimitz encounter involved multiple naval aviators and ship-based radar operators observing an object that appeared on multiple independent systems, behaved in ways that violated the expected performance characteristics of any known aircraft, and then departed at a speed that the radar operators on the ship could not fully track. And David Grush, the former intelligence officer, testified under oath that he had personal knowledge of programs involving the retrieval of non-human craft and biological materials, that these programs had operated for decades, and that the people running them had, in his assessment, engaged in illegal withholding of information from congressional oversight committees. He said he had been denied access to certain programs after making whistleblower disclosures, and that others who had tried to disclose similar information had experienced professional retaliation. The committee members asking questions represented both major parties and ranged from deeply credulous to visibly skeptical. The hearing did not produce a resolution. It produced something different, a formal, public, bipartisan record of the claim that the United States government possesses information about non-human phenomena that it has not disclosed to Congress. Whether that claim is true is a question the public record cannot answer. What is true is that the claim is now on the congressional record, made under oath by a person with an intelligence background and a security clearance, and that the institutional response from the government has been what the institutional response to such claims has always been, a careful arrangement of words that confirms neither the claim's truth nor its falsehood. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office was established in part to be the institutional home for these questions, to investigate UAP reports with proper resources and proper authority, and to report findings to Congress. Its 2024 historical review found no verified evidence of programs involving non-human technology or biology in any program it had access to examine. The AARO was careful in its phrasing. It said it had found no evidence in the programs it had access to examine. This is not the same as saying such programs do not exist. It is saying that if they exist, AARO did not have access to them. This is the Ouroboros of the UAP question as it has developed. Every official investigation concludes with a finding of no verified evidence, qualified by the acknowledgement that its investigative access was limited. Every limitation of investigative access suggests to those inclined toward the more dramatic interpretation that the limitation is itself part of the concealment. Every assertion of limitation from official sources is taken as additional evidence that whatever is being limited is real. Area 51 sits at the center of this recursion, as it has always sat at the center of it. The base whose existence was officially denied for decades. The base whose real programs turned out to be as extraordinary as the mythology had claimed, even if the nature of the extraordinary differed. The base that continues to operate under extraordinary security, conducting activities the public cannot know.
The UAP question, taken seriously and examined without the automatic dismissal that characterized official responses before 2017, is a genuine scientific and national security question. Unidentified objects performing anomalous maneuvers in restricted airspace are a real phenomenon,
attested by credible observers using multiple independent systems. Whether those objects represent classified American technology, classified foreign technology, natural phenomena that are poorly understood, or something else entirely, these are genuinely open questions that the available evidence does not settle. The history of Area 51 suggests that the category of classified American technology is more capacious than the public usually appreciates. It also suggests that the government's capacity for sustained denial is greater than most people intuitively believe. What it does not tell us definitively is whether the government is denying something whose nature is continuous with what it has always denied, extraordinary human engineering, or something whose nature is genuinely different. The desert maintains its silence on this, as it maintains its silence on all things. Whatever moves in the sky above Groom Lake tonight moves without explanation, as it always has, in the extraordinary Nevada dark. Section 15. The Psychology of the Secret Place. There is something worth sitting with slowly in the deepening quiet of this late hour about why Area 51 captures the human imagination the way it does. Why this particular dry lake bed in the Nevada desert has become the central totem of a certain kind of modern mystery, while countless other secret places generate only indifference. It is not simply that it is secret. The world contains enormous amounts of protected information, tax records, medical histories, corporate intellectual property, military operational plans, diplomatic communications. Secrecy is common, and most of it generates no fascination at all. Most of it is simply the ordinary maintenance of necessary privacy at various scales. What distinguishes Area 51 from ordinary secrecy is the specific combination of qualities it presents. It is a physical place with specific coordinates, and this matters more than it might seem at first. Abstract secrecy, the bureaucratic kind that exists in encrypted servers and filing systems, has no address you can drive toward, no fence you can stand beside, no ridgeline with trucks on it watching you watch them. Area 51 has all of these things. It gives secrecy a body. It makes the unknown something with geography, something that exists in the same world as everything else you can touch and visit and stand in front of. And the armed quality of the secrecy is significant. The signs at the perimeter do not say private property. They say use of deadly force is authorized. This is not the language of a corporation protecting trade secrets or a family protecting its property. It is the language of the state at its most concentrated, the language of something serious enough to require that particular directness. The existence of a deadly force authorization in the open desert communicates, without needing to say anything further, that whatever is on the other side of the fence is worth killing to protect. The documented history amplifies all of this. Area 51 is not a place that merely claims to have done extraordinary things. It demonstrably did extraordinary things that have been confirmed by declassified CIA documents, Air Force records, testimony from people who worked there, and the evidence of the aircraft themselves, which now sit in museums and are written about in official histories. The extraordinary things were hidden, sometimes for decades, and then eventually revealed. This is the problem for anyone seeking simple reassurance about what might remain hidden. If they hid the U-2 and the A-12 and the F-117, the pattern they established is a pattern of significant things hidden for significant periods. The confirmation of known secrets does not reduce the plausibility of unknown ones. If anything, it provides evidence for how long and how thoroughly secrets can be kept. Thomas Bullard, a scholar of UFO mythology, placed the mythology of Area 51 in the context of American trust in government. Before Vietnam, before Watergate, before the Church Committee hearings disclosed the extent of domestic surveillance and covert operations, American public culture maintained something close to institutional faith, a baseline assumption that the government, whatever its flaws, was broadly honest about the important things. That faith was damaged by specific and documented events, and once damaged, the relationship between official denial and public belief changed permanently.
Whether any such fact exists is not something this history can settle. What it can offer is the observation that the longing is real, that it deserves to be taken seriously as a human phenomenon, and that the place where it most intensely focuses, the dry lake bed in the Nevada desert, ringed by its mountains and its warning signs, is a fitting vessel for it. A place that has genuinely kept secrets. A place that has genuinely done extraordinary things. A place that continues, by all available evidence, to do something it does not choose to discuss. The question, held lightly in the mind on the edge of sleep, is not a bad kind of company. Section 15b. The long chain of those who kept the secret. One of the things that becomes clear when you trace the documented history of Area 51 across its 7 decades is the sheer number of people who knew things they did not say. At its operational peak, the base supported hundreds of workers at any given time: pilots, engineers, mechanics, electronics technicians, communications personnel, administrative staff, security, catering, maintenance. In the program's most active years, multiple programs ran simultaneously, each with its own cleared workforce. The Oaks Card program alone involved hundreds of Lockheed and government employees. The stealth programs of the late 1970s and 1980s involved hundreds more. The aggregate over the full operational period is in the tens of thousands of people who held clearances specific to programs operating from the base. Tens of thousands of people across more than 70 years who said nothing that was not authorized to be said.
This is remarkable enough as a historical fact that it deserves a moment of quiet attention. We live in an era that assumes secrets are impossible to keep. The internet and its habits of disclosure, the smartphone and its capacity for documentation, the general cultural assumption that transparency is both possible and desirable, all of these suggest that sustained large-scale secrecy is something that cannot be maintained in the modern world. And yet, the classified aviation programs at Area 51 were maintained with extraordinary fidelity for extraordinary periods by very large numbers of people who had every human incentive to talk. They had pride in their work. Pride is normally expressed through sharing. They had frustration with conditions. Frustration is normally metabolized through complaint. They had extraordinary experiences, things they had seen and done that no one outside the fence had seen or done, and extraordinary experiences are normally processed through storytelling. All of the natural human mechanisms for managing the experience of work operated against the secrecy, and yet the secrecy held. Part of the explanation is institutional.
The legal agreements were real and the consequences were real. The security culture at the base was not casual, and the monitoring of communications and behavior that was part of working in a classified environment was thorough enough to make inadvertent disclosure a more serious risk than deliberate disclosure. People were aware that they were being observed and assessed, and this awareness modified behavior in ways that were durable.
Part of the explanation is professional. The people who worked at Area 51 were, in the main, people who had chosen careers in fields where classified work was common, and where the professional norms around secrecy were deeply embedded. Military pilots, aerospace engineers, government contractors. These were communities in which the ability to hold a clearance was a professional credential, and losing that credential through a security violation was a career-ending event. The self-interest of continued employment and continued clearance access aligned with the institutional requirement for silence. But there is something beyond the institutional and the professional that the accounts of the workers themselves suggest. A genuine belief in the importance of what they were doing. A genuine understanding that the secrecy was not arbitrary bureaucratic restriction, but the practical protection of something that mattered. The Cold War in those decades was real and was frightening, and the people working on the programs at Area 51 understood in ways that were concrete and specific what the alternative to American intelligence superiority might look like. They were not keeping secrets for the sake of keeping secrets. They were protecting capabilities that they believed kept people safe. This belief, which was not naive in the specific historical context in which it was held, provided a moral framework for the silence that made the silence sustainable in a way that mere legal obligation could not have done alone. You can compel silence with law. You cannot compel decades of genuine discretion with law alone. The discretion that tens of thousands of Area 51 workers maintained over decades was underpinned by something more durable, the sincere conviction that the work was important and that protecting it was part of doing it properly. When the declassifications came and the workers were finally permitted to speak, what they described was not primarily relief at being released from an obligation. It was primarily pride. Pride in the work, pride in the programs, pride in what they had contributed to something real and consequential. The silence had been hard, but the silence had been worth it. That was the consistent testimony. This is, in its way, one of the most interesting things about Area 51. Not the aircraft, not the conspiracy theories, not the governments and the secrets and the cover-ups. The sheer human achievement of tens of thousands of people across 7 decades keeping a secret because they believed it was worth keeping. Whatever is being kept there now, in the classified hangars and on the long runways of the base, is being kept by people who have made the same calculation, who have looked at what they know and what the world needs to not know, and who have decided, as their predecessors decided, that some things are worth the weight of carrying quietly. The desert has always been good at silence. It turns out people can be too, when the reason is right. Section 16. The Long Sleep of the Desert. It is late now. The thinking of the day has settled into something slower and more diffuse. The questions that felt urgent an hour ago have taken on the softer edges that questions get at the boundary of sleep, where they stop requiring answers and become simply comfortable presences, familiar shapes in a room growing dark. Think about the Nevada desert tonight, if you would like. Picture it from very far above, the way the pilots of the U-2 saw it on early mornings when the sun was still low and the basin below was colored in the soft ochre and gray of the desert before heat arrives. The lake bed at the center of everything, pale and oval and encircled by its mountains. The basin so flat it might have been drawn with a ruled line. The whole thing impossibly quiet from that altitude, a composition in stillness and geological time. Bring the picture lower now, down through the clean desert air, past the altitude where the U-2 flew, past where the A-12 cruised at 3 times the speed of sound, past where the satellites photograph it now from orbit, down through the ordinary blue sky to the level of the mountains on the basin's rim. The mountains are made of ancient rock, Precambrian in some layers, Paleozoic in others. An archive of time so vast that the 70 years of classified aviation history at Groom Lake is a single afternoon in their record. The mountains do not care about classification levels. They were here before the fence was built, and they will be here when the last hangar has been emptied and the last runway has cracked back into the desert beneath them. They have watched everything that has happened in the basin with the specific patience of things existing on geological time. The U-2 was a brief silver flicker in their long watching. The A-12 was a faster one.
Bring the picture all the way down, down to the floor of the basin, the lake bed itself. Stand on it in the quiet of a night with no moon. The ground is firm under your feet, compacted silt, pale as old bone, perfectly flat in every direction. The stars above are extraordinary. The great basin, remote from city lights, offers a sky that most people have never seen. Stars layered in depth and brightness, receding back through the galaxy to distances the mind cannot fully process without a certain vertiginous sensation. This is what the workers at Paradise Ranch saw when they stepped out of the cafeteria after dinner in the summer of 1955. This sky, these mountains, this flat pale ground. The hangar behind them with the silver aircraft inside, the aircraft that would change what was known and what was knowable about the Soviet Union, about the Cold War, about what human engineering could reach when it had sufficient motivation and sufficient secrecy. Think about those workers for a moment, the mechanics who learned to service an aircraft that had no maintenance manual except what its designers wrote in real time. The pilots who flew to the edge of the atmosphere and looked down at a curved world and felt something that did not have a name yet, something that the astronauts would later call the overview effect when they had better language for it and a proper distance from which to have it. The engineers who solved problems that had no textbook solutions because no textbook had needed those solutions before.
They did all of this in silence. They did all of it far from the recognition the work deserved. They came home, those who came home, to families who knew them as people who worked somewhere in Nevada. They did not see their names in newspapers. They did not accept awards at ceremonies. They drove out on blacked-out buses, did extraordinary things in an extraordinary place, and drove back. The U-2 photographs that clarified the size of the Soviet bomber fleet, that refined American strategic planning in ways that may have made certain catastrophic miscalculations less likely. Those photographs came from cameras assembled in a Nevada desert by people whose names are mostly absent from public record. The intelligence from the A-12, the stealth technology validated by Have Blue, the tactical knowledge extracted from the MiG programs, all of it produced by people working in a place that did not officially exist.
and the strange lights that civilians saw in the sky above Nevada and reported and wondered about. Those lights were their work too, visible at the edges, glimpsed through the security that surrounded everything else. The unexplained was the shadow of the extraordinary. The base continues tonight. Whatever is happening in the hangars and on the runways is the continuation of a tradition that began in 1955 and has not paused. The tradition of building the thing that cannot yet be built, flying the aircraft that cannot yet fly, doing the work that will not be acknowledged until some future declassification review. Somewhere in the restricted zone, under those extraordinary Nevada stars, is doing something unprecedented tonight, with the same seriousness and the same professionalism and the same absolute discretion that has always characterized what happens at Groom Lake.
And beyond the fence, on the public road with the joke name, the occasional car pulls over. Someone rolls down the window. They look toward the restricted zone, toward the mountains and the darkness behind them, and they watch for a light that moves in an unusual way, that changes direction too quickly, that climbs at an angle no commercial aircraft makes. Sometimes they see one, sometimes they don't. Either way, they sit for a while in the desert night, stars above, silence around, the fence not far off, and something, some version of that quiet, persistent, entirely human feeling that the world contains more than it shows, keeps them there a little longer than they planned. The desert is patient with all of it. It has always been patient with all of it. The ancient lake bed, the extraordinary stars, the mountains in their geological indifference, the secret that has kept itself, and the secret that has been told, and the secret that is still being kept. There is something almost restful in it, if you find the right angle. The world is larger than what we are shown of it. The things being done right now in secured spaces are extraordinary in ways that will take decades to be known. The silence around them is the silence of serious work being done carefully by people who understand its importance. And above it all, above the hangars and the runways and the warning signs and the watching trucks on the ridgeline, the Nevada sky holds its depth. The stars are the same stars the engineers looked at in 1955, while they assembled something that had never existed before. The same stars the pilots saw from the edge of the stratosphere in the small hours before dawn. The same stars that shine now, indifferent and brilliant, over whatever is happening in the basin tonight. Some things keep their secrets. Some secrets keep themselves. The desert, old and flat and patient, keeps both. Sleep well. The stars above Nevada are bright tonight, and whatever moves among them will keep moving, quietly and purposefully, long after the questions have settled into dreams. Before you drift all the way off, if this quiet walk through the history of one of the world's most mysterious places helped you find a little peace tonight, it would mean everything to me if you would take just a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We are on a journey to reach 1,000 subscribers here on Heyo, and we are not there yet. Every single person who subscribes genuinely matters to getting there and to keeping this corner of calm history alive. When you have a moment, leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight.
What time does your clock show? What part of this strange story is drifting with you into sleep? And if you have any sleepy hype remaining, please send it this way. This channel is something I am building carefully and quietly, one story at a time, and your support is the whole reason it grows.
The desert is quiet. The stars above Groom Lake are extraordinary tonight. And somewhere behind the fence with the warning signs, the work continues. Good night.